Take another minute, we'll show up. All right, welcome back. So I started to get submissions for the quiz one. Looks like people, we have 5 or 6 submissions so far. And so please get that done by Wednesday at the end of the day if you can. I think everyone who's done it so far has done a good job. And, again, it's just working the repository, doing the 2 things the instructions tell you. I think, you can look at in fact, you can go look at the submissions that are already up there to see what it looks like. You need help. So I'm gonna try to go over that on Wednesday and show kind of, it's like maybe next Monday, I'll show the finished product, close to the finished product. Basically, I want to show how we have a bunch of people.
Oh, could you show us how to refresh it for it? I wasn't able to find it. Right.
Yeah, so let's see if I can do this quick. I go to, well, I'm gonna get this one. Well, actually, I could. So we have, I'm gonna go to one of the forks I have here. Let's say Chromium, try that. And so if you see this Chromium, this is forked from like Google's Chromium. And you see that there's this button here that's a sync fork, refresh fork. It'll have different, and maybe different names, but usually it's right there. So you just hit it and it'll sync. Let me try to do it now. So it's working. And it says this branch is out of date. Discard one commit. I did make a commit to that. Or I could just update the branch. And so now it's updated. And if I ask sync fork again, it says this branch is not behind the upstream. So it's taking everything from that upstream place, that main trunk, and it's cleaning it here and refreshing everything. And best of all, it's not overwriting everything. So it's just
How does it sync with the like your edits? I accidentally took the other one and I deleted all my work.
oh, how did you do that? You can't do that.
It said discard and I was like,
oh yeah, if you discard your commits.
yeah, I was able to find it and
Yeah.
do it, so it was fine. But
Okay, yeah.
how does it handle your data?
What do you mean? Like, how does it?
Say you edit a file and you're resyncing, does it just ignore that file when it's syncing?
I think it does, yeah, because remember I said every commit is on its own branch. So it's just sitting on that branch and it just, I don't know how it moves it, but it doesn't, like, unless you tell it to delete your commits, then it will. So yeah, just pay attention when you do that. Because it'll, sometimes you'll have work that's ahead of the trunk, and sometimes the trunk will be ahead of you, and you have to synchronize this. Any other questions about GitHub or about quiz? Okay, well, let's move back to our slides for today. So we're starting Unit 2. So Unit 2, welcome. And this is on kind of like documentation and things like that. So we're kind of moving on from the open source lectures. We're still going to talk about open source to some extent. We're going to talk about community building, documentation, and things like that. So one of the things about community, I think I mentioned community in some of the lectures before. And so, you know, a lot of times with open source projects, they build a community around it. And a community is really just a bunch of users, a bunch of people interested in it. And the benefit of having a community, of course, is you can do sort of distributed collaboration. You can leverage your community for, you know, different things. You can get them involved in your project. A lot of proprietary organizations like Microsoft, or even like something like Roblox, which is straight up proprietary, but it's got proprietary threats. They have communities because they want to engage people in their platform. They want people to develop with their platform and everything else. So think of that as a giant project where they have a community. And it doesn't have to be open source, but if you're not open source, then you have things in your community that you use to engage people with that project or the product that you're creating. So community building is an important part of sort of modern project management because, and we'll see in one of the lectures in this unit, how there's, you know, the main project, and then you have sort of an area in between the project and the outside world where you try to, you know, get people close to the project, get people interested in the project. And it serves as a place to recruit people who might work on the project or recruit people who, you know, advocate for the project or things like that. So it's a nice thing to have. But sometimes people try to just automatically sort of push a community into being. In other words, you know, community doesn't automatically come with a product, with you know, or it doesn't come in the absence. So to have an open source community, you must build an open project, then have community. So you can't really have community unless you have a source project. You can't assume, for example, that if you have a bunch of people in an interest group, so there are a bunch of people interested in 3D games, that they're going to come to Roblox, you know. There has to be some incentive for them to join a community, to be involved with that project. So you have to make a good project. You have to think about the kind of people you're bringing in. Remember, when we talked about the project vision, I asked you to think about the kinds of people you might serve or you might want to sort of cater to in your project. And this is sort of why, because you're going to be building that project or, you know, building out a community or finding a target market, you know, something that can lead to success down the road. But it all starts with how the project is designed and what the project does to offer. Another aspect of community, of course, is it's an inclusive endeavor. It really kind of helps. Sometimes it helps open source projects solve problems that if you had a room of 3 or 4 people, you couldn't solve one. And so, you know, this is a tool that you can use to foster development. I like to think of, you know, this in 2 ways. One is that you can leverage people from all over the world, from different places, in different skill sets, where they might be able to, you know, you bring them into a community associated with the project that might be able to, you know, work on a problem that you're having. And it's a lot easier than trying to find someone hire this ACE programmer who doesn't really understand project work or the needs of the users. The other aspect of this is, you know, it brings people into this sort of world where they can improve themselves. And that's actually how you build a strong community as well, is that you have, you know, you give people opportunities to participate in the project, and they sort of have a symbiotic relationship between the project and their own benefit. So they can learn things, they can work on projects, they can work on issues in the project that they wouldn't be able to work on otherwise. and it helps them build skills, and it ties them with the community more strong. This is from Derico Simmons on Twitter, wise words. When we limit who can participate, we limit the issues we can solve. So it means that, if you have greater participation, if your project is more inclusive, that means building a good community, a healthy community. That also means building a good project that has a good focus on what it wants to do. Then you can solve issues that you'll have. And it facilitates your ability to solve issues. So that's a little bit about community. We'll come back to that in a bit. But I wanted to kind of step back quite a bit and talk about the history of project management, because you're talking about communities, and that's nice. But we have to have, sometimes we have to think about the sort of style, work style of adopting in management. So, building a good community requires you to build a good project, have a good vision, but it also requires you to pick sort of the right paradigm for managing your project. And so we go back into the history of project management, we can see that in terms of information technology, there are a diversity of different methodologies that are available to you, your project on, to build your work styles on, to build your workflows. And so there's, of course, the waterfall approach, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the course. It's this phased methodology where you work on different phases of the project independently, and you tie them all together with, very detailed specs. And we'll talk about how that works later. There's also Agile, which you might be aware of. Agile is where you work on this iterative design process. Everything is about communication rather than documentation and specs. And, it's supposed to be sort of, they call agile, or it eschews a lot of bureaucracy. And that may be good for certain types of projects, but not others. Waterfall might be good for certain types of projects, but not others. And then, of course, open working, which we've been talking about for 3 weeks, where we talk about, how to do things in a way that's compatible with open source or open access, or, however you want to think. But it's this very open system where people can join and collaborate in a distributed manner. And, all the specs are open and they can customize it there, so forth. So those are kind of focused on information or information science. But I want to go back even before the 20th century and think about how we managed projects in ancient times, or how we managed projects before the Industrial Revolution, things like that. So before the 20th century, there were a lot of large planned projects around the world. We had pyramids and other monuments that people, that civilization would build, or complex chiefdoms would build. We had irrigation systems, which were necessary in some regions to farm, and you had to manage those and have like this sort of management scheme for that, manage how they were built out, how they were maintained. You had, of course, warfare. So warfare was coordinated strategy across large areas. You had to have a whole, hierarchy of people in an army to manage that. And then, of course, railroad network construction. This is where we start to get infrastructure like railroads, and then later the internet. You have to manage a network of infrastructure. So these are all things that kind of, the precursors of modern project management. And, you think, well, that's kind of far removed from what I'm doing, but it's really not. Because you can see in each of these, you have this sort of imperative to manage different aspects of a project. So you're managing, different teams, you're managing resources, you're managing things to do, things that need to be done, things that get delayed, all of that. Now, in the 20th century, we start with sort of around 1900, and this is sort of, the Industrial Revolution is really going at this point. And we start to get mass production. We start to get, we have factory floors where people are making these mass-produced things. And so a lot of project management and sort of precursors to the modern strategies are based on what was going on the factory floor in that phase of the Industrial Revolution. So, Frederick Taylor created the scientific management of industrial processes around this time. So again, this is like analyzing the factory floor and figuring out what the processes are, what the workflows are, how to improve performance of things that are mass produced. So you want to have very low error rate. You want to produce a lot of things in the same way, get them to the end of the line, very defined process, and that's that. So that's actually, a lot of project management. There's a lot of like planning and executing that goes on there. And around this time as well, Henry Gantt developed a bar chart approach to illustrating timing and project tasks and the progress of said tasks and timing. So if you've ever seen a Gantt chart, you know this is these intervals of time that you map onto a bar, you can map onto a graph, and you can manage each process as flow of time, their dependencies, so that dependencies can compound them. So you can see, I have to do this thing first, and then I have to do this thing second, and if I delay the first thing, I can't do the second thing. Or sometimes I can do something else while I'm waiting for the first thing, and it's optimal in terms of getting things done in time. So that's sort of where we are, and then this is, of course, pre-industrial project management, so people were building things like Stonehenge and geoglyphs, which are these large circles in fields, and then pyramids like the Egyptian pyramids. This is sort of the thing that I took off the internet about workforce organization. Basically, it's a hierarchy where you have teams working above other teams, so their teams maybe 200 workers. They're organized into these 1,000 worker gangs. And then you have a 2,000 worker crew, and they all just kind of are organized on these different types of tasks. They kind of report to a superior, and that's how you would get this sort of workforce organization. Now, that's a very hierarchical way to do things. In open working, we talked about things that were very distributed, and so there are a lot of options in between those two extremes that one can adopt. So that's a word about pre-industrial project management. So we talked about the early 20th century as being sort of the beginnings of modern project management. In the mid-20th century, we start to get some of these methodologies that are useful for information science. So now we're not really worried about the factory floor anymore, although people are still doing that. We're thinking about large information organizations like IBM or large offices where they're doing information processing tasks. They're automating things in that way. And so they're automating things, factories too. So you have to think about automation. And so, but more importantly, you're dealing with teams. And so, what teams are doing is important. So in the mid-20th century, we get CPM and PERT methodologies, which identify the importance of task sequences, task dependencies, and the concept of the critical path. So again, this is kind of like this idea that you have some tasks that need to be performed for other tasks. Some tasks are done in a sequence. So this is kind of like these workflows that we've talked about, where you start with one thing and you start with another thing. You might have tools that need to work in concert. So you can go from step 1 to step 5 without any sort of delay, friction. And so, and then of course, the concept of the critical path are those tasks that need to be done in order to realize some goal. So just thinking about like how teams work, how they interact with tasks, and how those tasks can be set up so that they're minimally difficult, but you can do them pretty easily. And so, and then of course, we have the project management body of knowledge, which is of course, just kind of assembling a body of knowledge of project management. This is kind of similar to the sort of the controlled vocabularies and some of the other things we talked about at Working Open, where you have this body of knowledge of things that you need to know about project management, things to know within projects that are important, and assembling that in one place. Now, a lot of the mid-20th century, this is sort of the managerial point of view. So this is what's important to, say, like managers in an organization. So like I showed that picture of the pyramids when they had these hierarchical work teams. And in this case, these organizations are very hierarchical. You know, you'd have a manager, and that manager would have managers, and everyone would report to someone else, and they were in charge of managing the team from the top down. So they had to have these kind of tools that are very essential to sort of coordinating with these team members. Now, of course, in the 21st century, we have, I think, a lot of organizations that adopted styles that are a little less hierarchical than that. We found that, for one thing, strictly hierarchical teams are a nightmare to manage. You often miss a lot, they're often very sclerotic and hard to change, things like that. So, there's that, but there's also this increasing recognition of project management as a specialized set of skills applicable to many different industries. So not only are we dealing with project management on the factory floor, or project management in a large information organizations, large offices, but we're dealing with project management in all sorts of industries. So you could be in a, bike shop or a restaurant or some other place where you wouldn't think that project management was a critical part of managing what you're doing, but nevertheless, it's useful there because they have these same processes, they have these same, relationships between teams, and people have to work efficiently. Also, project involvement is a source of career development and opportunity. So, this is more around, thinking about open source, thinking about how people can join open source organizations, or thinking about how people can join large organizations as interns and develop their own skills. And so a lot of times project management can be tailored to making these opportunities for people. It's not just enough just to get people to do their job, they want to have some sort of career development component or some set of opportunities outside of the team. And so this is where project management is sort of heading in these directions. So I think this is from Adrienne Lott's book, Project Management, which is on the syllabus. So if you're interested in more of this history, you can go there and read about it. I think this is important to recognize kind of the history and think about all the diversity of approaches that have been developed, not just in information science or software engineering, but other areas as well. So this is the waterfall, and this is what I was talking about before. This is where we have a very rigid sort of set of specs for each stage of developing a project. And I bring up the waterfall approach at this point to show kind of how you might think about project design from kind of the inception to not just the release of, say, a product, but maintaining that product or maintaining your own organization. And so in the waterfall approach, and this is independent of communities, this is independent of organizations, people have implemented the waterfall approach mainly in software engineering, which you can use for other domains as well. Basically, you have to start somewhere. And so what you do is you start with the requirements of what you want to build. So say you start your project and you have this project vision, and you say, project vision is, I want to make this piece of software. And so the first thing you have to think about, of course, is, how would I even get started? What are my resources? What kind of a community do I want to attract? What kind of users do I want? How many resources do I have to devote to this? And then once you do that, according to the waterfall approach, you seek out the requirements. So, it's not just the requirements of the organization, but it's the requirements in terms of what the specs are for the product that you want to build, or the outcome that you want. So say you want to build a version of a piece of software. You start with the requirements for that piece of software, knowing the requirements for your project, community, and so forth, because you specified those, even before you get to this requirements. Then you think about those specs, and you have to think about them very explicitly. You have to kind of work them out. You have to work out a first draft specs document. And then you go to a design phase. So You figure out what you kind of need, what your constraints are. Then you go to a design phase where you try different designs. You go through those. And this is very much like agile at this point, because agile is really, about iterative design. We won't talk about agile, but just know that like agile is really focused on iterative. Kind of like cycling through different designs, trying things, failing and starting. In this case, we're not really doing design. We're kind of thinking about our constraints, thinking about our requirements, and then maybe designing some options, some prototypes. And then, we're building specs. So we know exactly what those things should look like. We have something in mind. We think about the design in terms of like how, maybe we have 3 or 4 different options for an implementation. And then once we have those 3 or 4 options, then we decide what we want to do. So we could take one of those options and then actually do the implementation step, which is where you figure out how to make it. And, it could be that you need to figure out what kind of programming resources you need or kind of people you need to sort of fulfill the implementation part. And then once you get the implementation part done, you go to verification, which is testing it, to make sure it works. And then you release it, so you have maybe a software release. But then you have this last step, which is beyond just releasing it into the world, which is maintenance. And maintenance, of course, is where you just make sure that it works. Over time, you maybe have new versions that come out. You maybe correct bugs, fix bugs. And at this point, the verification and maintenance steps, this is where I think it's most useful to embed a community of users, a community around your project, really give you feedback on what, how well you're doing and what kinds of issues you want to fix. But you can have communities embedded up here in the design phase or even the requirements phase. But in waterfall, you really need to spell out the specs and spell out the documentation. And then after you do that, then people can modify things. But it really relies upon the sort of top-down specification. I'm going to define everything. And so you can embed a community in different locations in this process. But this is the process that, of course, in waterfall they use to go from sort of this idea of a project to some product and then maintaining that product. And then ultimately maintaining the project. Because if you don't maintain your project, you can't maintain your product. It's like a lot of companies will go out of business and then they'll have products in the world that they don't maintain because there's no one to maintain. So I took that aside into project management to give you sort of an idea of what we're building a community on top of. And so, you might ask, why community building? And I said you can build community, you can embed communities into different phases of some product design in your project where you're trying to implement something, putting it out into the world and you're trying to maintain. So, sometimes you have people who design things that are actively harmful to people. And sometimes you have people who are designing things that have a very ethical focus, where they have a very, well, this is a quote from Anil Dash, who's a tech person on social media. Says there are people making tech who are positive, ambitious, thoughtful, inclusive, curious, empathetic, and self-aware. They're going to win. Now, this was 10 years ago, so they haven't won yet, but I guess that's a point of view that says, we value sort of the inclusive, the thoughtful, the empathetic, the self-aware over what's not that. And so that's like that, again, this is a value statement that is, you can approach your project in different ways. You can approach it like this, or you can approach it in other ways. But basically the idea is, you want to have a good culture. And to have a good culture, sometimes you need to interact with the outside world. So you need to kind of go and look at what people want out of tech. What do people find useful? What do people find actively harmful? And when you figure that out, you can't just send out questionnaires, just kind of think really hard about what people might want. You actually have to engage with people. And this is where the community comes in, because community can help you achieve these kinds of larger goals and plug them into these different stages of product development. So another, a good example of how this works, of course, in open source, one thing that's been really successful is, allowing the community to be involved in software bug reports. So Anil Dash has a blog post on community safety. And in this, this is about like building a tool, to, basically keep the internet safe. But, in general, in open source software, we do these software bug reports. And that usually gets farmed out to the community. So what will happen is that there will be a software release, and then people will get the software and they'll install it on their machine and they'll run it. And there will be people in this community who are recruited to monitor the software for bugs, maybe push the software to its limits, maybe play around with it, see what the bugs might be, they encounter bugs, report them. And there's a system for reporting bugs where you can take, you can fill out an issue on GitHub and say, I found this bug in the software, does this thing, and then of course you get this list of issues, and then your maintainers within the organization can go down the line and fix them. Or you can have people in the community volunteer to fix it. They'd like to see better software. And so that's often what happens in a lot of open source communities, is that people will get a new release of software, they'll sort of play with it collectively, and bugs will do this in a systematic manner, and then they'll get fixed, and then we can have a better product at the end. So it's a sort of iterative design and maintenance, but it's done sort of in this community setting. And with community safety, Anil is asking the question, can we handle community safety, reports of online threats being an example, in a similar manner? So can we report online threats in a way that's like bug reporting in a communities, in a community setting? So, this means that we can do a lot of different functions, maintenance, and even of design, using a community, leveraging a community, whereas if we didn't have a community, we couldn't do these things, at least not as efficient. So, when you have a community, and I already gave two examples, one of bug reports, one of community safety. Sometimes it's important to say, okay, if I want a community and I have a strong project, and I know how the community fits into them, what do I actually want my community to do? And you might think they can do everything. They can do anything I want them to. But that's actually not a good strategy forward, because, of course, you want to limit what they can do. You don't want them to, sometimes you don't want them to be involved, say, in rewriting the code, because they might not understand your workflow. They might not understand what's going on in the code, so forth. So you might restrict it. You might say, I don't want the community to be, I want people on an internal development team. And then what I want the community to do is X, Y, and Z. It might be like maintenance of bug reporting, or maintenance of, use cases, or something that maybe, usability, something that they have access to. And, it depends on the project. Sometimes projects want people to contribute to the code. Sometimes they want them to write the code, and sometimes they just want them to use the code and, kind of maintain things on their own. So there are a lot of variations. So, when you kind of think about building a community, you might think of things that you want them to do. So examples of this include in Linux and in Git, which of course are two open source projects that we mentioned. They often use their community to solve problems. So they'll set up maybe like a discussion forum, which we will talk about in the next unit. And then this discussion forum will kind of pose problems. Sometimes people in the community will pose a problem. Sometimes the problem comes from some problem people are having with a bug, or they don't see functionality in the product they wish was there. And so they ask the question to the community, how do we solve this? Does someone want to help me build this thing, this feature in the software? Or maybe, how do we get something to run better? Or there are all sorts of problems you can solve organically. You have to discuss them in a discussion forum. But sometimes the community is encouraged to do this because sometimes in case of Git, it's community driven, project is driven by what the community wants. And the people doing the, at the center of the project are just there to sort of facilitate. They built the core software, but everything else is up to. Sometimes though you don't want that, and that's a choice. In OpenAI's case, they want to engage the product space and lock in expertise. So they have a very different way of looking at communities. They want to find people who have expertise. They want to get them kind of connected to that brand. They want them to use OpenAI, and they want to engage the product space and figure out what people want out of the product. And that's, they're not letting them really do any development or suggest new features. That's just how they do that. And of course, some organizations use their community as an extension of the user base. So, this might be good for bug reporting, marketing, or technical support, where they basically solicit people. People are able to start threads in their discussion forum about, different types of problems that they're having, different types of things that they'd like to see. And it's just kind of like giving the users power to interact and to suggest things. But again, this is not like, this is very different from solving problems for panic. It's just a different level of engagement. Then there's, of course, as a public service, so Hugging Face and Mozilla are two platforms where they have a community as a public service. So Hugging Face archives a lot of machine learning models. They offer machine learning models to people. People can use them, contribute models, they can download models, they can contribute and download data sets, and their role as a project is just as a public service is to maintain all of these different models and facilitate people using them. Mozilla is kind of like that with internet safety and open source. So, there are different types of projects that are just focused on serving communities of people interested in something. And then we talked about stable diffusion, I think in the last lecture. In their case, they're trying to leverage the creative capacity of users. They're trying to encourage them to create things on their platform and contribute them back to this community. And, so you're basically engaging them. They're not really problem solving, they're just creating. And, they're doing it on your platform, and which has benefits on its own. So it's not exactly like how OpenAI is. But the point is, different organizations will approach what they want out of community different. Now, there's this article, it's called The Paradox of Open, and then another article called The Paradox of Open Reading. And this is about kind of talking about how open approaches can flourish, but they can only flourish under certain conditions. So just because you have an organization, project, well designed, you know what you want, you have a community, you've chosen to become an open source project, it doesn't mean that you're going to find success. It means that you have the potential for success, but you're not quite there. We need to kind of figure out how to make it. Sometimes if you think about like the underlying conditions, sometimes that means that even less well-organized projects will be successful. So it just really depends on the kind of conditions. But we can actually facilitate this by building different types of communities and building different types of infrastructure that really facilitate openness. So open source communities can both sort of facilitate and benefit from these kinds of situations. So we learned that open approaches flourish under two types of conditions. Number one is where projects where many people contribute to the creation of a common resource. So this is like Wikipedia, OpenStreetMap, Blender.org, and the countless free software projects that provide much of the internet's infrastructure. So, when you have these kind of when you want to take an open source approach, oftentimes if you're trying to get many people to contribute to the creation of a common resource, that's where you can really benefit from the approach. If you're trying to build a proprietary project, maybe you don't want to have it. And that affects how you design your community. And so number two is circumstances we're opening up is the result of external incentives, requirements, rather than voluntary actions. This is a story of publicly funded knowledge production, like open access academic publications, cultural heritage collections in the public domain, and open government data. So this is where, there are incentives for doing this. So what happens typically in, say, like open access is that, people just don't do things out of the goodness of their heart. Sometimes, they can be paid. Sometimes that's with a common resource shared, and there's this incentive to contribute to something that everyone can use, including yourself. Sometimes there are external incentives that maybe the government puts in place, or a corporation puts in place to facilitate things that are sort of, that get opened up. So what I mean by that is, like, in a lot of cases, governments will fund the creation of open resources for publications, or open resources for software repositories, or things like that. And so, you can have these external incentives requirements. Sometimes large corporations might do this for, like, they'll have a bounty hunter program for bugs, or even for people who have a lot of good skills that they need for a project. So you can incentivize people to do things in a community. You can either incentivize them externally, or you can, say that we're building this common resource that everyone can use. So people will be motivated either. The other thing is that when you build communities, you get to benefit from networks. And this book by Yochai Benkler is The Wealth of Networks. This is where he talks about the power of having a network of people. It could be users, it could be some community, rather than a couple people in a room or these hierarchical teams. So when you have hierarchical teams, a person might report to a manager will report to another manager, so on and so forth. In a network, you have people who, establishing ties between one another, sometimes in very different areas of expertise. They're benefiting from those ties in ways they wouldn't benefit from sort of hierarchical structure. And so he talks about the wealth of networks, and that you can build wealth in those networks, usually of some sort of social capital, but they're also very valuable connections to make more generally. Okay, so this is, again, going back to these different types of open approaches that need to be in place to have good communities, to have healthy open projects. This is where we talk about artificial intelligence regulation and how openness is playing out in this area. I was just reading an article where there's kind of this massive fight over, like, what the open standards will be in artificial intelligence. Because again, like we said last time, this is an area where it's sort of a frontier where, people getting, they're high stakes because there are a lot of organizations that are just kind of establishing in the space. And so there's this idea of what is open going to look? Is it going to look like what we typically have with open source software, or is it not going to look like that at all? What is open going to look like? And of course, that's important for community resources, or government standards, and things like that. So this is talking about artificial intelligence regulation and policy, and talking about how these debates about openness are playing out. In the last several years, advocacy on these issues have been driven by digital rights concerns. Last year, it became clear that this debate is one that the open movement cannot avoid. So working open also kind of depends not only on incentives made by governments, but on limitations placed on them by governments, and some of the things that people, have to be sort of abide by. 2022 is the year when important AI models were released openly. So had these initial forays into sort of this open space, but also one in which a new approach to open licensing aimed to reconcile a traditional open source approach with a concern for responsible use. So in this case, we're thinking about making models open, trying to mimic sort of the benefits of open source communities, open source organizations, but at the same time, we have to be mindful of some of these limitations, especially, with respect to ethics, but also with respect to government limitations. And this will affect how you set up your community, correct? Because your community has to abide by these. You have to have sort of a way to think about that space and what your limitations. So, if you set up a community, open source community today, and if you're doing an open source AI project, in 5 years, you might have to make very different, you might have to make very different decisions about what's open and what's proprietary, or what your community might be doing in your organization with respect to your organization. So this is an important aspect, and using AI is kind of an example that they give here. And so they talk about, kind of building things for a stronger commons. So this is one of our incentives, is creating these resources for the common good. So thinking about how to make that commons as strong as possible using the community. So they talk about here, they talk about their work where they're looking at stronger forms of commons governance and layering that on top of what we've been calling open access commons. So they talk about the term layering, which is that there is a space for a basic open ordering, which should be applied to a lot of public non-personal data or to publicly funded media content. But there is also a need for other commons-based arrangements in cases where the basic open model is folks. So what they suggest is that when you have these different resources, say I have, we talked about how your project might generate data. Maybe non-personal data that you want to open up, or maybe personal data you need to keep proprietary. And you also have other types of assets, like, different types of intellectual property, images, other types of things, where they all have their own sort of requirements for, keeping them proprietary versus opening them up. And so, building a project around this, you need to really think about what you have, what your strategy is going to be. You might want to layer things in terms of how your community is involved. So you might, involve them in certain things that are open, that don't have a lot of liability to them, but you might not allow them to interact with things like personal data or other types of media content that's maybe licensed. So there are different ways you can build a community, thinking about sort of the complexity and limitations of what you can do with different types of content, different types of media information, and so forth. Okay. So another thing I want to talk about is that when you build a community, it's not just a homogeneous group. It's usually a pretty heterogeneous. But when you have a project, maybe say, for example, media player or some sort of software that is like some sort of AI software, you're going to, depending, because you're focusing your project on a specific topic, you're going to be engaging with these communities of practice. And communities of practice are a tool where, we're interested in looking at sort of what people are using the project for, maybe like the product that you built from it. And, make all the possible different things that they're looking for out of product. And then kind of where that fits in. So this is a graph of all the different products that exist, that are in this sort of classification. These are various open source and internet technologies like Facebook, LinkedIn, Google Docs, Dropbox, Yahoo Answers, TED, the TED Talks, Skype. So there are really a diversity of technologies, but you notice that, say, with Skype, it's in this category of synchronous communication. Whereas Wikipedia straddles the line between sharing expertise and online learning. So you have this, like when you build something, when you have a project, and you have some sort of product that comes out of that, you're going to have these communities of practice that you're naturally going to engage in. So for example, people who are doing synchronous communication, they probably aren't really interested in Wikipedia that much, but maybe they will use it sort of a secondhand way. But what you're interested in here is you want to see what kinds of things people are using what kinds of groups of people would be interested in this. So for like TED, it's online learning. So if you built some sort of TED Talk clone or something like that, that you're going to be targeting people who are interested in them. If you build a Skype clone, you're interested in people who want to do synchronous communication. So you can build a community pretty easily, thinking about these groups, thinking about these needs of these groups. So a community of practice is a group of people who share a common concern, a set of problems, or interest in a topic, and who come together to fulfill both individual goals. So basically, this allows you to target these different communities, people in these communities. Say, we have this great product, come join our community. You can target that community with things that they're interested in, and you have automatically built in, what kinds of things do we want them to be involved? We want them to be involved in building a platform, or we want them to be involved in like getting word out about it, or something in between. And so there are all different ways you can do this, but having these communities of practice is important for sort of focusing your efforts. Now, this article here, 4 types of open source communities, this is actually from a business professor's perspective. But what they do is they think about open source software communities, and they think about the 4 different types that exist, kind of ranging from sort of, this open source commons with free and open software to something that's more proprietary. And so that's where they're coming from on this. But as they see it, there are 4 different types of open source communities. And this kind of focuses on those communities of practice and some of the other things we've talked about. So the first thing are these single vendor open source projects. And so in a single vendor open source project, we usually build an open source project to build some sort of enterprise or some sort of software that's used in general. But they're basically interested in building one thing. Well, they want to sell the software, because they're kind of focused on that one thing. They want to have like a captive market. The other is developer communities, and these are built around specific interests. So developer communities might be people who come together to build some sort of open source software, and then might move on to another project. But these are people who want to do the development. And it's pretty generic because you can build just about any type of software you want based on your interests. We have user communities where people are interested in solving problems and sharing development costs. So what they mean by user communities here are you have a number of open source projects that come together and they want to solve problems collectively and share development. So you as maybe a group of 3 or 4 people won't be able to afford certain things that you may need. We'll talk later in the course about like security needs, or like sometimes open source projects will need to patch bugs and they don't have the resources to do it. And so how do you overcome that? Well, you get band together with other like projects and you share the development costs, or you advocate for yourselves, or you come together to solve problems. And then finally, open source competence centers. So this is where you have large centers that coordinate open source projects. Again, this is like making sure that open source projects with smaller concerns have a larger entity above them so that they can have some sort of way to coordinate what they're doing. So you don't want 5 projects all doing the same thing. Or if you have 5 projects that are kind of doing complementary things, they can be brought together under one umbrella and they can benefit. So these are 4 different types of open source communities. Again, this article advocates for these, and probably others, but it just tells you, just goes to show that there are different ways of organizing projects and managing projects. Sometimes you just have the basic plain, small project. Sometimes you have larger projects. Sometimes you have these programs which include multiple projects. And sometimes they're more focused on selling enterprise software. Sometimes they're based around these communities of practice and interest groups. Sometimes they're organized around practical concerns like maintenance or sharing costs. Okay. So sometimes we have projects with no community. And so, you don't need to have a community, but it helps to have a community. So this is news diffs. They don't have a community, they just have like their contributors. The news diffs is an interesting project because what they do is they basically build software to allow people to take news articles that were released at different times and compare the content. So like if you take an article from the New York Times, written like six hours after the event, and a New York Times article 6 days after the event, they actually change the content quite a bit. And so the idea is you want to be able to compare the two versions and look at the changes. And this is useful for a number of reasons, reporters, for historians, for other people who might be interested in how these things change and how people use information. So this is a nice project, but there's no real community. It's run off of someone's GitHub account, and they don't really need a community, at least an online community. What they do have are they have users and they have word of mouth. And so, the community here, there's no imperative incentive to have a formal community. So that's one example of a project where there's no imperative for it. On the other hand, this project, Hugging Face, of course, as I mentioned, is very community oriented. And why is it community? Because it's one of these places where you can share models, where in fact the community serves as the sort of lifeblood of the project. And so this is not run off someone's GitHub account. You don't typically have an offline presence. The whole idea of a community is to embed it in a project that you're running. So in this case, what they do is basically offer different services, documentation, augmenting that documentation. You can host your projects on this space. You can build, a user base where people use your models. And so it's a facilitatory thing, but the community is very central to this. So you can see that there are these different project types that either use a community, don't have a community, or use a community in different ways. So when you're building an open source community, there's 6 things to consider. And again, I think we kind of hit some of these, but I'm going to go again, organized fashion. The first is, what is your purpose? So again, you know what your purpose is. You have the vision statement that has some purpose in it. You have your open canvas, which also gave you more purpose to your project. Now we're asking, what is your purpose of your project? What is the purpose of your community specifically? So what do you want them to do? So your community is what in relation to your project? Do they just simply use it? Or do they interact with the interface? Do they add value explicitly? Or do they just kind of use it and add value outside of your organization? That's just, the way it works. So, you can set this up in different ways. So some examples include where a community of practice promotes your project to a user base. Your community is involved in developing new attributes to your project with features, or your community is for education. So, like in the case of news diffs, there might be an educational imperative, a strong educational community. And that isn't really managed by the project per se, it's just that world, that's some community of practice interested in what news diffs does. Sometimes communities are involved in developing new features in your project. So maybe Hugging Face, you get, new features that are requested by people who are sharing models. And then sometimes the community will promote your project to a user. So again, that could be both Hugging Face and news diffs, where people are, the community is saying through word of mouth or through demonstration, this is a good project to follow, you should engage with. The second thing to consider is how should members behave. And of course, we talked about this with governance. You want to have some sort of project culture. You want to continue that through the community. Sometimes your community will have a distinct culture from the project, but again, that's up to you. You want to have community standards, meaning that if they do contribute in different ways, you want it to be regularized. You don't want people to kind of just do their own thing. And engagement sometimes leads to involvement, or actually oftentimes leads to. So sometimes communities will develop engagement strategies, how to get people involved in the project, or how to get people involved, say, educational activities, tutorials, and that will lead to greater involvement, which then benefits the project as a whole. There's some investment there, but then the payoff is actually greater. And then, the third thing is how to determine the state of your community. So if you decide to build a community around your project, you need to sort of get a sense of how well it's doing. So you don't want to have an unhealthy community because there's no point in investing in it. But at the same time, you want to know what their, communities of practice are, what their interests are, how they're sort of engaging with the design that you've set for the community. So maybe, it turns out that getting people to contribute to the code base is not a great idea for a number of reasons. So sometimes communities will be reevaluated, they'll remove that from the community and just say, well, from now on, we'll just have a different system for contributing to the project. So there are different ways, you have to sort of get a sense of what's going on and then reevaluate your community and then, maintain it accordingly. So, managing a community is like managing a project. You have this global state, which is the big picture. How close are you to your goal? Sometimes the goal of building communities is to gain as many community members as possible. Sometimes it's to make a small community that's really engaged with what they're doing. Sometimes it's to find people who can come in and, do things that act as developers or advocates. And so you have some sort of goal that you have, maybe for 6 months or a year with your community, what you want to achieve. You want to maybe recruit 1,000 members, or you want to have 50 people who could really do a lot of good contributing to the project. And so then you can evaluate how close are you to that. Sometimes you don't get close and you have to rescope your community, just like you'd rescope a project. And then sometimes there are local measures, like you can look at how well working groups are doing, or look at the well-being of individual collaborators to make sure that they're okay, make sure that they're engaged with the project. And then depending on your goal, that's important. You can also use quantitative metrics and indicators such as like dashboards, like we saw with GitHub, where you can look at how much they contributed. You can kind of make it competitive, saying, this person has done a great job of contributing. All sorts of different little mechanisms like that both you to gauge how well your community is doing and to sort of tell the rest of the community how. Now, the caveat here being that large or growth is not always better. A lot of times we think of larger growth as being better in organizations, in life, and even with projects, larger growth is not always better. Sometimes you want to remain small for various reasons. Sometimes you don't want to grow at all, you just want to build the quality. And those are all things you can, design for. So, the next thing is what other communities are similar to you? So if you're going to build a community, the best strategy is to go out and look at organizations that are like you in many ways. You do the same type of thing. You have the same sort of openness, values with respect to openness or proprietariness, and you see what they're doing. And then you say, well, is my organization about the same size? And we have some resources. And if so, you can copy some of the things that they're doing. And if not, you can say, well, this is a good idea, but we can't do this because we're too small, or this is not really, it's not in our culture. And so, this is again where you look at communities doing the same things, organizations doing the same things. Sometimes organizations will have goals and you can collaborate with those organizations. Sometimes you can build build a community in concert with those organizations. And you get a sense of what kinds of things the community is good for, what kinds of things the internal organization are good for, and so forth. Then there's this high-level engagement plan. So, really when you build a community, you need to have this engagement plan where you want to figure out how to recruit community members. Sometimes you have to go to their communities of practice. Sometimes you need to go to like the news diffs, you need to go to a place where there are a lot of historians, journalists, make them aware of it. It doesn't make much sense to make computer scientists aware of it unless, you know, you want to draw their attention to what you're doing in terms of coding. But so you have to recruit community members different ways depending on what their interests are. And one way to do that, of course, is to use personas, which are these tools that allow you to model the type of person who might be your target for this community endeavor. So if you're interested in like your average journalist, you know, you figure out, okay, what kinds of things are they looking for in a project? What level of involvement they want to be. Sometimes they don't care about the really nitty-gritty technical details. They just want to see what a project does. With programmers, they want to see the opposite. Sometimes they don't necessarily care what the project does, they want to see the nitty-gritty technical details. So you want to design a persona that is sort of reflects those different needs, the different types of people you want to recruit here. And then finally, consistency and evangelism. And so when I say evangelism, I mean like there's this term tech evangelism, which is where people go to conferences and they talk about the technology or a project and they say, this is the future, this is why, and they kind of go, and it's very much the primrose path, but it does give people an idea of the great things that you're doing. But moreover, you need to be able to advertise by internet, social media presence, and go to different tech conferences, wherever your people are that you want to target. And you want to recruit ambassadors, people who can say, yes, this is a good project. This is, you know, I'm the word of mouth. I'm the example that you want to live. And they'll tell you why it's good. And so there's this aspect of sort of tooting your own horn that's important. Getting people recruited both to a community and making people aware of your project. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of finish up with this set of things. Now, when you think about this in terms of your project, okay, I'm gonna just skip that for now. I'm gonna bring that up next time, but so, you know, one of the questions I get asked sometimes is, what is the sort of the first step of starting a project, as well as the community? So, you know, we think back to the project vision, we think back to the open canvas. What we're doing is we're defining sort of the constraints of our project. Who's interested in the project? What is it? You know, what are the resources we need? But we never say like, what are the steps that you need to start? Because it's easy once you've started to kind of perpetuate. But to actually get something started is really, I think, the stumbling block for a lot of people. And this holds true in a community as well, because in communities, you know, we have to start like getting people involved in a project, and they say, I want to do this thing. And you're like, okay, well, get started. And then they probably fail because they don't know how to get started. Or in a project, you might say, we're going to build this feature, but we don't know how to start building the feature because we don't know where to start. So we looked at the waterfall methodology and we had those steps. But that still doesn't really help us think about the different steps we need to take to sort of get something in a coherent package. So what does the first step look like? So first steps can be the way you define what we call project scope. We'll talk about project scope later. And it's basically like, how much do I want to tackle? And this holds true for your project, your internal project, as well as your community. How much do we want to cover with this? Do we want to do everything, be all things to everyone, or do we want to like focus ourselves? And the same thing holds true for action items within your project. And we want to start by building this great thing and just say that's a target thing that we want to do, or do we want to really restrict ourselves to say I'm going to write 50 lines of code today, and then start with 50 more lines? Well, you don't need to be that focused, but what you need to do is you need to define the scope that fits your resources, fits the people that you're working with. So you have to think about your things in terms of a first step, a second step, and a third step. Prioritize them in some way and make sure that you understand their dependencies. So you might say, okay, I'm going to build 50 lines of code today, 50 lines of code tomorrow, 50 lines of code next week. By the end of week 2, I'll have 150 lines of code. Now, if programming worked like that, that would be great, but it doesn't really work. You have to write code then you have to debug it, then you have to sort of rewrite it, get people involved, make sure it works in that, in a number of contexts, make sure it works with other code. So there are a lot of things that you don't want to like assume the steps are a certain way when that's not how it works. So you need to define, how to build things, how to prioritize the different things that you want to do. You need to be able to group and link potential tasks, but you want to understand them first. You want to understand the kinds of things you need to do for second, third, and why you. What are the things that you need to do for second, third, and are they necessary? So sometimes when you start with a project or start in a community, you want to do something and you're trying to figure out how to start. And you say, this is a logical first step, this is a logical second step, this is a logical third step. And sometimes in your mind, you sort of take one step and break it into two, or you take two steps and kind of join it into one. And so it becomes frustrating when you can't complete the second step very easily, because you didn't break it down into these brand new pieces that you can accomplish them naturally. So this is something that we need to think about, and we'll talk more about scope later. It's kind of a magical thing that we kind of have to think about in projects. So another thing is, we need to use a criterion for carving the project that it's joint. So what I mean by that is a saying from philosophy, where you take a problem and you kind of figure out the pieces that the fundamental pieces you can like kind of attack them one at a time. And so we need to do that with projects as well. We need to take this project idea, we need to break it down into sort of the pieces, the units of doing something. And then we need to figure out how to do those things. So we need to carve those pieces down to different steps. But all the while, we need to be aware of how things actually work. How do they, you can just break them down kind of logically, independent of how they actually work. But when you're working in teams and you're working with technology, it's not always just as easy as doing the logical thing. So sometimes you want to take your issues and you want to sort of prioritize them in some way, because you don't want to just do them kind of, sometimes you hit a roadblock and you get frustrated. But so sometimes you want to do things in different kinds of ways. So you might pick all of the low-hanging fruit, which means you pick the easiest stuff to do first, and you get all those things done. Then you can do the next set of easiest things, and then the next set. And that may be a logical way to organize your project in terms of if you have 2 or 3 people on your team, instead of like 20 people. If you had 20 people on your team, you could do them in the order of like thinking about the project, problem logically, and sort of just think of problems. Oh, okay, yeah. Another way to think about it are to identify and avoid your biggest potential bottlenecks. In other words, if you see things that are obstacles, you can actively avoid them for now, and then build things until you get to those, inevitably get to those roadblocks and then solve them later. This allows you to sort of gain some momentum, and you're not discouraged at first sight. We'll talk about why not being discouraged is important. Community building later in the lecture. There's also contingency. So we do the things that are going to sort of that other things depend on first. So contingency-based approaches to do the things that are kind of central or core to the enterprise, and then the things that depend on what we do later, obviously, because we can't do those things until we do this other thing. So we can, the idea is that we have these different strategies of delegating tasks, of kind of picking tasks that should go first, second, third, and those are important to get that right, because then you're able to get people to, you're able to achieve things and get off the ground and not worry, not get frustrated at like the first or second task. The second point here is that the scope of the project equals the scope of the tasks to completion. So you don't want to pick tasks that are too onerous. You don't want to pick tasks that are really easy, because you don't have you don't develop a good sense of what the right sized item is. And so we will revisit these issues in coming lectures. And the slide I skipped over, I'll probably talk about the end of next, or at the beginning of next time. So that's all for today. Did we have any questions on quiz 1? Well, we know a lot of you haven't done it. Yeah, 6 people have done it. Remember, it's on GitHub and you have to fork the GitHub repository to do it. Also, remember there are two parts. There's the name file and the file that you have to create. Those are two things. So make sure that you've done both. All right, that's it for today. Thanks. See you Wednesday.